What's up everyone, and welcome back to another video. Winning off spawn is something that a lot of players seem to struggle with in Fortnite Chapter 4. I know that a lot of you guys are feeling like no matter how much you practice your drop or how much you loot, an insane player always swoops in and sends you back to the lobby almost every game. But as you know, Teckoh's got you covered, and in today's video we'll be discussing how to win off spawn every game in Fortnite Chapter 4. I'll be covering a bunch of tips that help me personally to survive off spawn more often, and these tips should help you to play more consistent, survive off spawn, and set yourself up for a great mid and end game. Before we get into it though, be sure to drop a like if this video helps you out, subscribe if you're new and you want to see more content just like this in the future, and consider using code Teckoh in the item shop as well. It's 100% free for you, it only takes a few seconds to type in, and it seriously does help me out a ton. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who uses my code. But with that said, and without further ado, let's get into today's video. So the first topic to consider when it comes to surviving off spawn is the classic question of where to land. On the Chapter 4 map, especially when I'm making this video, there really aren't many options for drop spots. Maybe this is different by the time you're watching this, maybe they've added new POIs and stuff, but when I'm recording this video, there are only 9 different POIs on the map, and that means each individual spot is going to be much more contested than previous chapters and seasons. So with that said, the place you land is going to largely depend on your overall playstyle. If you're playing passive and you're going for the win, or you're playing a middle ground playstyle where you're not hiding but you're also not W keying, then your best bet is probably going to be an unnamed spot. The unnamed spots on this map are also relatively limited currently, mainly because the map isn't very developed yet, but there still are some very good options. Generally, if you're playing passive, you're going to want to land at a quiet spot or loot route, often toward the edge of the map, and use that instead of a major POI. If you're playing a moderate playstyle, you could get away with landing at some of the more quiet edge map POIs where you're probably still going to be contested, but you won't be contested by an absolute ton of people. The two that come to my mind for that playstyle include Breakwater Bay and Lonely Labs. Those are two kind of like somewhat low-key spots, but they're still POIs with good loot. If you're interested in knowing more of these spots, then I do have a pretty recent video about the best solo drop spots, which you can feel free to check out as well. If you're playing a more aggressive playstyle, then the options for where to land turn from unnamed spots to POIs. Personally, when I'm W keying, some of my favorite drops tend to be Anvil Square, Slappy Shores, and Faulty Splits. However, pretty much any major location that's relatively centered on the map works perfectly fine. Wherever you guys decide to land, I recommend you use the website Fortnite.gg to plan out your loot route and drop area. It's a super useful website which shows all sorts of things like chest spawns, floor loot, vehicles, and all sorts of other stuff as well. You can use Fortnite.gg to get a better idea for how your drop spot is laid out, which areas have the best loot, and ultimately how you can strategize your early game to dominate your drop spot. Once you know where to land, a huge key to surviving early game is going to be to land at your spot consistently to practice it. You obviously don't have to land at the same exact spot every single game, but you should have at least 1 or 2 consistent spots where you basically drop in and know exactly what you're doing. Especially if you struggle to get good loot off spawn, having a consistent drop where you know all the loot spawns is definitely an underrated factor. Moving on from that, now that we have drop spots figured out, the next key to surviving early game is preparing for fights. In order to win your fights in early game, you're going to want to have at least a few things situated. These primarily include your loot, materials, and your HP. Regarding loot, of course you're going to want to have a decent automatic weapon like an SMG or an AR. You'll also want to have a shotgun and preferably some extra heals as well. For materials, I recommend trying to get at least 200 to 300 or so materials before you start pushing into early game fights. Of course, you might not have time if you're like directly 50-50 at your building or something like that, but that's just the optimal amount. And lastly, you've got HP. HP is a pretty self-explanatory one. You're going to want to have a good amount of HP and preferably hold some extra heals in case they're needed. I think having 200 HP should probably be your goal in early game. I really wouldn't recommend pushing into a fight unless you have all 3 of these factors sorted. Of course, you won't get them all every single game, and chances are you're probably going to have to fight earlier than you'd like to pretty often, but having these factors all in line is super helpful in improving your odds of winning a spawn fight. One quick note is that you should always try to minimize your downtime when you're looting, farming, etc. It's really helpful in early game when you're contested to be able to get the jump on your opponent early and get loot, HP, and materials earlier than them. This is a huge part of why I recommend you really nail down your drop spot. That way you know how to loot it in the most efficient manner and ultimately get in a better situation than your opponents. This helps you to avoid those situations where you're running around trying to figure out where the loot is and where you can farm materials, meanwhile your opponent is getting kitted up and preparing to push you. Another very quick tip I have for you guys here is that when you're gliding in, you should always watch to see where other players are landing. Having a good idea of where your opponents are landing can help a ton when you're planning out how to actually approach your fights. In early game, the first player to get the shots off or get the jump in the fight is often the one who wins, and knowing where your opponents are is a huge help. So now that we've gone over where you should land as well as how you should prepare for fights in early game, the next topic is going to be fighting strategies, aka how to actually win your fights in early game and survive off spawn. The first tip I have for you guys here is to try and be as resourceful as possible during early game fights. I know we all have that natural tendency to want to go for crazy outplays and do some wild build fights and stuff like that, but in early game that doesn't fly. In fact, it's really just a quick and easy way to run run out of materials and get killed. Instead of focusing on hyper mechanical plays, focus more on playing smart angles and holding right hand peaks. In early game, it's usually not the fastest editor or the best builder who wins the fight, at least not necessarily. Rather, it's the person who makes the best use of what they have and makes the smarter moves within the fight. Now, of course, if you're being sprayed hard or you need a build to stay alive, then absolutely do that. I'm not telling you not to build. My only point here is that when you're in the situation to play resourcefully, you should try to maintain as many materials as you can. Moving on from that, another tip I have for you guys in early game fights is to focus on third-party opportunities. Early game fights are usually a shambles fest, and especially after getting out of a fight, players tend to have way less materials, have lost some HP, and they're in a pretty vulnerable spot overall. You can even go at this from a distance by sending some shots their way, and especially if they're fighting in the open, you may be able to actually get an easy kill on someone who's already low in the middle of a fight, and then you could just swoop in and finish off the other person too. So with that in mind, when you have a clean third-party opportunity in early game, it's definitely a smart idea to go for it and see if you can clean things up for some easy kills. The third tip I have for early game fights is a very simple one, and that's to play patient. I can't tell you guys how often players in early game get too amped up to finish their fight. They go for a wild play to try and finish the fight fast, and they get wrecked for it. Early game fights often come down to less of the mechanical skill and more of the IQ. Your goal should basically be to outplay your opponent through efficient looting, positioning, peeks, and things of that nature, rather than just running at them aimlessly and hoping you can win the fight. I can't express this enough. When you're the person playing patient and your opponent is the one trying to do anything they can to get at you, you're in a winning situation because the second they make a mistake when pushing you, you're able to capitalize and either get some big damage or secure the kill right there. There are some situations where you're going to need to clean things up quickly, such as if you're both out of materials and you can't disengage, or if the zone is coming up on you, but overall, the concept of playing patient is an important one and something that many players miss out on when they're trying to win early game. The fourth and final fighting tip I have for early game is one that often goes overlooked as a practice method, and that's to practice box fights. Box fights are pretty much the ultimate early game fight simulator. Most of the time, your early game fights are going to be 1 or 2 boxes away and will largely consist of 2 players trying to get the better angle or peek to win the fight. That's why when it comes to practicing early game fights, box fights are a must. What I recommend you do though is not to actually jump into a box fight wager map or anything like that. Instead, the way I like to box fight for early game practice is to go into an empty creative map with a friend and simply box fight in the open instead of a closed in area. Basically, you're going to want to play it out as if you were low on materials and try to avoid turning it into a build fight. This will allow you to practice box fighting in an early game type of environment. There also is value to practicing the closed in box fights like you'd find in like the Clicks box fight map or other similar maps, since they do help a lot with learning how to peek effectively and how to outplay people in close range situations. I guess you can kind of compare them to like fighting inside of a building during early game, so they do have some level of carryover, but I really wouldn't recommend them as your only practice method, especially if you're a good player against a good player, since they pretty much just turn into a battle of whoever's better at peeking from a top right corner at it, rather than who can actually outplay their opponent in the most effective manner like in a real match. Overall though, mixing it up between these 2 box fight methods is a fantastic way to improve your early game fighting skills. But with all that said guys, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on how to win off spawn every game in Fortnite Chapter 4. Overall, by following all the strategies and tips from this video, you should find yourself surviving off spawn much more often and being much more successful in Fortnite as a result. If you found this video helpful, then be sure to drop a like on it and consider subscribing as well if you're new to the channel and you want to see more content just like this in the future. I try to post tips and tricks videos almost every single day, so be sure to hit that notification bell too, that way you won't miss out. And finally guys, if you want to show some extra support, I would really appreciate it if you could use code Teckoh in the item shop. It's 100% free for you. It only takes a few seconds to type in, and it seriously does help me out a bunch. As always, a massive thank you to everyone who uses my code. But with that said, thank you all for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.